Yeah.
Okay.
I just want everybody to move up. I took a shower last night, or this morning. I just want to let you know. I took a shower. I know, right? Yeah. I even do extra and wash my hair.
Okay, as we get started, just as a reminder, we've got the mics out in the center aisleway there. If you got a great command voice, and you can't get to the mic, go ahead and use that. That'll help us expedite the questions. And then just, please be recognized before you ask the question.
Yeah, if you sit closer, we may not need all that.
It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Miemie Byrd. She's got a little bit of a resume I want to share with you. Dr. Byrd is a professor at the Asia Pacific Center at Security Studies, not too far, right, from here.
Across the street.
That's right. Byrd, she researches, teaches, and is published in a number of areas to include U.S.-Burma relations, security dynamics in Southeast Asia, economics and security linkages, rising inequality and its implication on security and the roles of the private sector, women in education and socioeconomic development, civil military operations, leadership, organizational development and innovation, and transformational learning and adult education. This is just to name a few of the things she does. She's also a writer, and she's authored a number of things. Her topic today, though, will be on cultural sensitivities to enable effective information sharing. So without further ado, let's welcome Miemie.
Aloha. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. And I'm just a different animal, though, based on my background. I am not going to be talking about technology. But I think that it is connected to what I'm going to talk about is it's an underpinning of our cooperative, security cooperation in the with our coalition partner, especially emerging coalition partners. So I think I wanted to introduce a couple of security cooperation framework and how it connected. And as we are exercising this security cooperation activities and how culture come into play. And that's what I wanted to talk about. And especially for, like I said, emerging coalition partner in Asia Pacific. And specifically, we're looking at, Southeast Asia and South Asia. Because in Northeast Asia, we are partners like Japan and Korea. We've been working with them for a long time. But in Southeast Asia, we have potential partners. And how do we go about cooperating with them to a point that we can have an integration, right? So how do you get there is what I wanted to talk about today. And how do I do this thing? Next. Okay. So in a relationship, right, I would say this is the pyramid of relationship. The networking at the bottom is the lowest level of relationship. You're just networking and you know each other. But then going up all the way to the top, which is collaboration, where you're starting to work together from the beginning to end, cradle to grave type of relationship, right? So I would say interoperability is in the higher level, right? Higher level. And how do we get to that? So I wanted to talk a little bit about cultural sensitivity. So here, obviously you're interested in my topic. So how many of you feel like you're culturally sensitive? Do you consider yourself culturally sensitive? Do you? So when you think about cultural sensitivity, what is the first thing come into mind? How do you practice it, right? So anybody? Huh? You listen, okay, you listen. Okay, what else? There's some people saying they're culturally sensitive. Acceptance. Okay, acceptance. This respectful. Okay, all right. So those are some of understanding patterns of behavior that are different from yours. Okay, yeah, those are very good behavior and principle to live by. And I want to add to that, many of you may already know what I'm about to say, right? You may already been unknowingly practicing it, but I'm just tying the academic work to confirm that you're doing a great job and you're on the right path. And then at any given moment, just jump in and I don't want it to be just one way. If you have something to offer or some example, I would love to hear it. Please get up and share, right? Is that okay? So according to DeWitt and AFCEA, right, they said that security cooperation requires 3 elements. First is necessity. The partners, the parties has to understand that there's a necessity for cooperation, is first step. And second, he said they have to have a habits of dialogue. They have to develop habits of dialogue. And then the third is the inclusivity. And they all reinforce each other, according to AFCEA. Do you have any, do you agree with that? Do you agree with that? Inclusivity is one of them. Inclusivity, according to AFCEA and DeWitt, is important element for trust building. Being inclusive. Do you disagree? Agree with any of the elements? Agree. Okay, why do you agree? You're in sales? Okay, all right. Talk a little about why you're in sales.
A saying I used to have was that all things being equal, friends do business with friends. All things not being equal, friends still do business with friends. So be friends first.
Ah, okay. Be friends first. Yeah, no, that's good. You do. Does it go toward the continuing education? Is my session goes toward the continuing education? No? Oh, okay. And then this is the second, so the first was the first framework. Second one is a work of Ansel and Gash on the collaboration. And this is also, again, building cooperation is a process, right? And according to Ansel and Gash, the first step is in building cooperative relationship or collaborative relationships, face-to-face dialogue. Face-to-face dialogue is very, very important according to Ansel and Gash. And especially in our AOR, dealing with Asian culture. Asian cultures are considered to be high context culture. High context culture means that the meaning does, very little meaning come from words, is based on the context, nonverbal, and other things that's surrounding it. So especially in our AOR, when you're trying to develop relationship and cooperative, especially cooperative relationship, face-to-face is the key. And it has to start with that. Okay. Another thing is, yes, so in Asian culture, right, we use a lot of indirect communication. Indirect communication. And back to what it was saying, high context, the meaning is coming from the nonverbal, indirect context space. So that's in my, also in the regular human-to-human communication, according to research, that the meaning is made by the word is only 10%. 30% is tone, and 60% is nonverbal. And that's regardless of culture, according to study. So now we have, especially in this population, right? You guys are very tech savvy, and there are all kinds of technological innovative mechanisms that allow you to communicate. But according to our study, the face-to-face still is the highest value communication, and especially toward building relationship at the higher level. So another example I wanted to give you, the face-to-face, how powerful face-to-face is, that I teach at Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, and most of my students we don't call them students actually, we call them fellows. And they're from all over Asia Pacific region. In any given course, we have about 100 of them coming from 35 to 40 countries. So we make them play. So one of the purpose of our center is for security cooperation. That's what we practice. And so we will make them play prisoner dilemma game. Prisoner dilemma game. So does everybody know prisoner dilemma, right? Yeah? Yeah. Game theory. So we will break them into 2 groups, and then they play 10 rounds. And then first 2 rounds, they don't talk to each other. They have to make a decision to either cooperate or to defect. And based on what they're doing plus what the other team's going to do, they get a point, right? So we play 10 rounds of that, and 3rd round and the 8th round are face-to-face dialogue. But the rest they have to do it on their own. And it is so interesting to see every time right after the 3rd round, after the first face-to-face, there are less defection. And especially if they have to meet the person face-to-face on the 8th round, they are less likely to defect. They're more likely to play cooperative, right? And I had one of the fellows say, if I'm going to go out there and face them, we got to live by it. We got to live by what we said. So the face-to-face has this quality of social integrity. And especially in our region, losing face, right? The culture significance of face is really, really important. So understanding those are also very, very important. Okay? Any other question or any comment on that? Do you see that? Do you disagree with what I just said? Okay, go ahead. Right. I would place it as second best, right? It would be a second best, but still face-to-face. So, for example, you can see this element being practiced within ASEAN. ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, right? It's 10 countries, right, in our Southeast Asia region. They have over 1,000 meetings every year, because that is what it is needed for the region to stay connected, to develop relationship, to keep peace in this region. So they have over 1,000 meetings. And back to, and I know as a Westerner, a lot of the critics of the ASEAN will say like, oh, they just meet too much, they just sit there and talk. But it is kind of not understanding the Asian culture and the need, the high context nature of Asian culture, right? So yes, there's something to do, but again, it doesn't, when you're doing a video conferencing, right, it doesn't give you the full context per se, because context doesn't mean that you're just in the meeting talking to you, but there's maybe having coffee with them, having, meal with them, all that stuff come into play to create this context, right? And so that's something that I think that as a Westerner have a little bit of difficulty understanding the context, contextual nature. Yeah.
I just want to make a comment about your comment. When you are president of the department, it sort of shows you care. And there's no substitute for not being there. Being there is no substitute. And sometimes we have to argue with the boss about going to a place. But they don't always understand the importance of participating, being present, even if the meeting's short and not just a long, drawn-out thing. The thing that makes a big difference in terms of building the trust that's needed in order to get those documents
Yes,
But it is absolutely not a substitute because you're being able to.
that's absolutely correct. That's right. Yes, yes, that's right. So, anyways, so that is face-to-face is still the premier way of getting to develop, relationship in especially in the Asian context. Western culture, of course, is low context, and meaning is a lot of meaning. They're explicit meaning, and they're more direct, right? But from the Asian perspective, sometimes our directness, a Westerner directness, is seen as too blunt. So there's something that you might want to consider as you're dealing with your Asian counterparts. Yeah. So why do we do face-to-face is we're trying to go toward trust building. Yeah, and trust is something that very difficult to cultivate and to grow, but it's very easy to lose. In a very split second, you can lose a lot of trust. And one of the things is consistency. Consistency is one of the key things toward trust building, because your action has to match with what you're saying, following through with the commitment. Right? And those are really, really important. So sometimes from our side is a little bit difficult because we have this rotating, the revolving door, right? People come and go, and as well as some of our policy are based on our election cycle, and that could appear in our, our coalition, our partners' eyes as not being consistent. So that can go toward, make it very difficult for us to build trust, right? So all the stuff that earlier speaker has said on being able to share and, use the same system, but it's all built on this soft and squishy thing called trust, right? And it is squishy because, trust is a feeling. It's a feeling, right? So and it's also based on human behavior. And, I have some framework to tell you, but we have many frameworks, actually. I'm just introducing you just two, right? Because human behavior is so complex that no one theory, one framework will work. But I'll show you two, and then I'll pull together like a common elements on my third slide. That keep on appearing in some of these frameworks, right? Anyways, all right, this is consistency. It's really, really important. According to Ansel and Gash. Yes. And then communication and habits of dialogue. Habits of dialogue. Habits of dialogue is really, really important, and it's also appear in earlier, right? The earlier framework by DeWitt and Achaya is habits of dialogue. And it's because back to face-to-face and habits of dialogue goes hand in hand. And when you have a habits of dialogue, when you have to come back to the person, you're more likely to live up to, it's a living up to your commitment and your having that consistency. And back to ASEAN. Because ASEAN is, I will use ASEAN a lot, because ASEAN was grown and developed organically by the regions. It was nobody, and they embedded a lot of local practices, local culture into the way ASEAN work. And that's why sometimes the way ASEAN works drive Westerners crazy. But that is, they organically grown from there. And so when you look at some of the practices, they borrow some stuff from like a Java village practices, and and as the result, ASEAN is 52 years old, and it's working as it is because they have done it with the indigenous culture built into it. Yeah. So I wanted to use that as a way to demonstrate some of these concepts that are playing out in this cooperative institution called ASEAN, right? So I wanted to do that. So So ASEAN has annual meetings, like I was saying. They have annual summits. They just had the 35th ASEAN summit of the head of states, and we didn't show up. And so there was a big dust up. They ended up boycotting U.S.-ASEAN meeting. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. And that goes toward, building trust, right? So when we're not being consistent or having that respect. They see it as not having that respect. And then once you start building trust, you go to, and then you can start building to a shared understanding, right? Shared understanding, having a clear mission, common problem definition. So when we started to develop common problem definition, right? And because of the way we see the lens, so from the United States, we're looking from outside in, right? From the regional perspective, they're inside out. So whenever we say something like maritime security, right? Maritime security, they think of it as like illegal fishing. Illegal and unregulated fishing. But when we talk about maritime security, right, we have a different meaning to it. So understanding those is really important toward cooperation later on, right? If you just having maritime security, let's cooperate on maritime security, but people come at it from different direction, right? It's harder to cooperate. And so, and especially also in our region, all our security challenges are very complex, and it's a multidimensional, right? So when you think about, so we have maritime security is one. We think of free and open Indo-Pacific maritime slots, and then we think about the great power competition. From them, they think about human trafficking using maritime, drug trafficking, illegal fishing, their resources, right? The maritime resources that they need. So, a lot of our security issue that we're dealing is multidimensional. So in order for it to understand each other enough and then coming up with what is common, it requires a lot of talking and a lot of coming together and creating that habits of dialogue to build that common understanding. So whenever I talk about drugs, right, drugs trafficking in the region, sometimes some of the people will define drugs problem as a health problem. They're looking at through the lens of the health problem, right, epidemic, right? And then some people are looking at it from a socioeconomic angle, economic problem. And some people are looking at it from a law enforcement problem, right? And then some people will just look at it supply and demand. And many times we look at it from the supply side, right? We want to stop the supply. And whereas a lot of people in the region think of it as a demand problem. If the Westerners stop demanding the drugs, there will be no supply, So even just talking about drugs in the region, it has many aspects, many dimensions to it. So in order for us to cooperate, we have to come together and create that common understanding is important. So, and then identification of common values. It's very interesting, according to these guys, the common values are important. But in order for us to come up with, develop a common value, we have to suspend value judgment. Value judgment. So someone said earlier, right? Just accept them as they are, or what did you say that? Someone said something. Yeah, acceptance. So how do you go about doing that? Accepting.
I don't know. This is a harder question than I thought.
It is.
I think face to face, I think that even non-verbally you can accept someone, like a kind of a non-verbal way that you are with that other person. I don't know. I don't know if
Yeah.
I'm getting somewhere, but
Yeah. So
That's
if
what
you
I
don't
think.
pay attention to yourself, it's a little bit more self-reflection required. Because when I was training to be a researcher, I had to do a lot of interviews, right? I had to do a lot of observation. When I'm doing observation, what I found, or most of my classmates too, is when we start writing our observation, it's always riddled with some type of a value. You know, I think she's happy. You know, so happy, sad, glad, or, you know, positive, negative come into that. Being able to look at it just purely the activity was really, really difficult. So if you're not really reflective, whenever you're doing something, you're watching someone does it, it's automatically will flavor with some type of a judgment. Some type of a judgment. Right? So it was a very eye-opening for me to go through the training to become a researcher and do all these observations and take the value out of it. But that's what he's saying is that to identify common values, sometimes we have to suspend our value judgment so that maybe their certain cultural practice, their practice may be different from us, from the Westerner, but the value behind it may be the same. But sometimes because we put the judgment to the activity or the practice that we're looking at, you know, we couldn't get through it to get to to understand the value behind the activity. Does it make sense? Yes, of course, yes. Right, right. Right. Well, you're countering human behavior, right? Like I was saying, I had to go through the training to be that. But just being aware and being reflective might give you a little bit chance to develop these, open up your aperture a little bit more. Open up your aperture so then you can get over that. So I'm trying to think of example of a cultural practice that we will see, different, that will have certain judgment on us. You know, maybe I can't think of. I know from the Asian, right, the left hand, right? When you use left hand, you don't want to touch people or you want to shake people's hand with the left hand because left hand was always used for something else, right? Unclean. Left hand is considered unclean. So when the Asian person is in an American culture, if you're left-handed, you may touch people with left hand, and if that kind of gross you out, and they can't get over that. You know what I mean? So then that's what I'm saying is trying to understand it and suspend some type of a judgment so that you can find the common, get behind the practice. You know what? Because the left hand, touching with the left hand because it was unclean, that means it's disrespectful, right? So disrespect is the value behind the practice of touching with left hand or touching the head, right? So those are disrespect. So just getting beyond those practices and suspending the judgment. That's what I was trying to say. It's not that easy. Like I said, I'm not saying it's easy. And developing trust is not easy. It's easy to look in the, in a little graphic, but actually trying to do that is a very difficult, and then it could take a long time, yeah. Space, yes, that's right, yes, that's right. Some culture has a lot less space, and some people has a larger space, and understanding that also can play into that. In some culture, you look into their eyes, that means you're very aggressive, right? And some people, for our culture, if we don't look in how you're being shady, right? You don't trust them. You know what I mean? So those are the different type of cultural differences, and see if we can find a way to suspend it so that we can, get beyond it. So that's what they said. And then commitment to the process, mutual recognition of interdependence. So back to earlier framework talking about you have to have a necessity to cooperate, right? So that's kind of same along that line. And then share ownership of the process and openness to explore mutual gains and risks, right? That's kind of developing relationship. If it is one-sided, it's all gain for me and, all loss for you, it's probably isn't going to be, to work well. So, and that for commitment to the process, again, from our perspective in a strategic level with dealing with some of the countries, right, because of our policy changes, suddenly we can't stay with the commitment that we made, and then it breaks the cycle of trying to develop relationship. Right, and let alone, you can't even cooperate, let alone doing the interoperability with some of those guys, right? Yeah. So it's helpful to look at the building relationship with our potential partner by using this little framework and where the breakages or where their weaknesses are for us. It's been very helpful to me. It's more, when we're thinking about the problem, like all the information is swirling around my head, so I'm always looking for some type of a framework, yes, a like of a basket system to like kind of organize my thoughts. So hopefully this is something I give to my fellows, my student as well. As a teacher, I'm always looking for some type of a framework to organize our thinking. But again, it's not the only way to organize it. That's why I'm showing you a couple of the frameworks. But hopefully that it's easier to, think through and look at the problem by utilizing some of these frameworks. Okay? And then intermediate outcome, doing small wins. And that's something that, like a pilot project. You don't have to cooperate at the interoperability level, but maybe doing something small. So I think that at PACOM, right, we've been doing HADR, right? We're using HADR as a small wins to come together and cooperate, and that's a good way. But that could be other things that we can use to develop these small wins to develop our relationship. Like someone earlier, she was talking about Olympics, right? Coming together at Olympics to a security for Olympics or whatever is something small, something low-hanging fruit to cooperate is helpful. So that's the process according to these guys, Enzel and Gash. And of course, throughout this whole process, you're practicing kind of a cultural sensitivity, because you're going to deal with someone that is away from your culture, outside of your culture. Even within the United States, we think of we as the one monolithic, but it isn't true, because my husband is from the South, and I grew up in California. California and the deep South, they have different, for a while it was really difficult because certain thing that what means in my culture in California isn't really exactly the way in the Southern culture. So even in the United States, that could be some flavor of that. But definitely from Western to Eastern culture, of course, is a lot more, there's a lot more gap. Yeah. Any other question, comment, observations? Disagree, agree?
So what's the framework for when you don't achieve, or when you don't have a clear mission, or when you don't identify common problems and all that stuff? So these are positive things, but what happens when you don't? Obviously, you're not going to build trust, but what's the algorithm using this framework?
So your question is what you are unable to come up with the common problem definition, right? Back to what we were saying, like maritime security, right? Our definition of maritime security is different than Malaysia's definition of maritime security. Right, I say that because I'm about to have I'm helping them put together a workshop on the Coast Guard Coalition, right? And we're trying to assist them, and they're developing agenda, and we're trying to say proliferation, right? The South China Sea, and they got no IUU. They only worry about, illegal and unregulated fishing. So, but we ended up going with the IUU because we're going to do the workshop in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, and we thought that the face-to-face interaction was more important than going after the common definition of maritime. So over time, hopefully, we're thinking that they will come to see, as they're face-to-face working with them, that they will come to see and understand what maritime security means to us. You know what I mean? So we went with it. So that's what we did to to answer your question using my real life thing that I'm doing with the Malaysians. Does it make sense? Okay. Yeah, one other thing in maritime security too is we're working with DITRA as proliferation, non-proliferation is one of the items that we have in mind when we think about maritime security. So, yeah. So all of them, so this is from the earlier two, but as well as from other framework that I looked at, those three things keep on showing up. Inclusivity, consistency, and identification of common value are the three elements that is needed for cooperation across culture. And for us, it's a bit, again, back to, it's really difficult for us from time to time because of some of our policy. We cannot exercise inclusivity, right? So, example, again, and I'm a Southeast Asia specialist, so a lot of my examples, or all of my examples are from Southeast Asia. So we have a central ASEAN centrality policy, right? We really support ASEAN, and we want ASEAN to stay together. We support because the ASEAN unity. But we don't synchronize our policy for ASEAN with each individual country's, our policy towards individual countries. So for example, we have a CHOD conference, right? Chief of Defense Conference for ASEAN, and we cannot invite certain countries. And that is exactly what China is trying to do, is trying to break ASEAN apart. Because they want to, back to great power competition, is that if the ASEAN doesn't stay together, if they do not stay together, it's easy for China to manipulate, right? So, but we're not synchronizing our policy with the ASEAN unity with each individual one, so we don't stay consistent. And we break the principle of inclusivity, and so therefore it's hard for us to cooperate with, and especially with the ASEAN members in ASEAN. And like I was saying, just recently, just 2 weeks ago, ASEAN had their 35th, ASEAN summit of head of state, and then we didn't send the right level of, representation for us, and so 7 ASEAN nations boycotted the meeting. and only 3 showed up. One was the host nation, because it took place in Thailand, so Thailand Prime Minister was there. The Laos was going to be the next ASEAN chair, and then like Vietnam was current year ASEAN chair, so they were there. But other than that, other 3 didn't show up, and so those type of activity kind of goes toward breaking some of our consistency and inclusivity. So, yeah, it's a little bit difficult. So, according to literature, right, cultural sensitivity, like I was saying, suspension of value judgment is one of them. Shifting perspective to understand differences in the meaning, shifting. And then third is being able to develop empathy. So empathy means, you don't have to agree with it, but just trying to understand where they are, where they're coming from. And especially when we're looking at our very multi-dimensional security issues, right? It's like the elephant and the 6 blind men story. Does everybody know that? Elephant and the 6 blind men? It's an old fable. It's an old fable from Sanskrit. So there are 6 blind men. They've never seen an elephant, blind men. So they went to see the elephant, and so each one of them touched different part of the elephant. So the one that touched the tusk said, "Oh, elephant's like a spear." And the other one touched the trunk and said, "Oh, elephant's like the snake," right? The other one touches the ear and said, "Oh, elephant's like a fan." And so on, right? Different person touches the elephant, but they're all right and they're all wrong because elephant is all that. And so security issues that we face in our AOR is like the elephant. It depends on what you touch is what you define that. So in order for us to come up with the total common understanding of what the entire elephant look like, is we need to cooperate, come together, and dialogue, right? So that we can see the entire elephant. So that's always the appropriate example to use in the Asian context. Everybody knows that in Asia. We learned that when we were little. The 6 blind men and the elephant. So, anyways, that's about it for me and regarding to the cultural sensitivity and the security cooperation, how it all related to each other. So people without cultural sensitivity are unaware that they are projecting their own cultural values. And back to what you're saying, like a learned behavior, right? Yeah. And so that's my Southeast Asia. Any other question or comment?
The slides will be available.
Yes, we are available. Yeah.
I saw you in one of the previous,
Yes.
I like so much what you said, I want to make sure I come back to it.
Thank you.
Because what I do business globally, I'm trying to teach other people how to do business globally.
Oh, okay.
And that's exactly how you teach people to do business.
Oh, okay. Okay, all right, yes. It has a lot of applications, right? Whether we're doing security cooperation or you're trying to sell someone, building trust so that they will.
A lot of this relates because sometimes I'm selling directly to a country that's the end user.
Mm-hmm.
I understand them.
Yes.
On a personal level. And then sometimes I'm working with a company in that country and together we're selling a whole system to a third country. And that complicates it, just makes it more.
Right. And earlier, presenters said that, electricity has become commodity, right? And we can it's in the background and you can assume that but I don't think you can assume that. Not in Southeast Asia. And there are many places that are not, they don't have electricity, So it's an example, right? In her cultural view, right? She thinks electricity is just like breathing air. It's just there. But you can't assume that if you're going to operate in our AOR, and especially in Southeast Asia. Yeah. Okay. You want to say?
No, I was going to say every place I go to has electricity. I just have to bring an adapter.
Yes,
It's the same thing
So I have a small IT consulting and services business, and so when people come from the mainland to here and to do business here in Hawaii, we kind of have to give them a little cultural session to know how to work and operate even here in Hawaii, which is a U.S. state. You know, you don't just blast in there and, you know, give your set of requirements and demand this and that. You know, we have a culture here in Hawaii of talking story. And so you'll get along so much better if you'll sit down and you'll adapt to the culture and see it from our point of view. Yes, yes. And one more comment about shared values. Something I noticed is how most cultures value their elders, but it shows up in different ways. So I noticed, you know, perhaps at a grave, people are going to give offerings or incense or leave food for their elders, whereas maybe in the Western culture, it's going to visit grandma or taking her out shopping or whatever. So it's still, you know, sometimes you can look and say, well, why are they doing that? That's just very odd. Or they're burning paper, you know, but really just realizing that shared value in the background.
Right, the shared value versus practices, right?
Exactly.
Practices may differ, but
Right, the value is the same.
Right, so you're trying to get to that. Yes. Yeah. If we peel back a lot of our practices, then we will see that they're, you know, very similar values back in the behind the scene. Yeah. Okay. Anybody? Yes.
Yeah, putting it in the context of military networks, I retired out of Indo-PACOM J6, and we, in our DoD culture, we like to make things simple. When we're going to have a JTF that includes all of us in a joint way, plus, for instance, and I'm going to get to Japan and Korea, and there's some very nice scenarios where we should all be sharing the same information with each other. And I think there's a huge roadblock there, in part because of the relationship between Japan and Korea, not because of what the U.S. would like to help share to make us all stronger together. Could you comment a little bit about Japan and Korea and maybe how Indo-PACOM or desk officers should try to help overcome that so that we can increase our information sharing?
You know, and I would apply some pieces of that process, right? Face-to-face. I think that face-to-face is really powerful. So more chances they have to come together, you know, they will realize that, you know, compare being from Southeast Asia, looking in Northeast Asia, I mean, Japan and Korea has a lot more in common than to, you know, Southeast Asian looking at it. For Americans looking at the, you know, you're like, what? There's Southeast Asia separate from Northeast Asia? But, you know, being a Southeast Asia specialist looking at the Northeast Asia, they have a lot more in common. And so their ability to, you know, overcome the history, right? So that's something I tell my students. We try to have Japanese and the Korean in our courses together. And when they are, it's not very often because they have to pay themselves to come to our courses, so sometimes they don't come. But when they come, they ended up like partying together. They have a lot of similarities. So, you know, so I would tell them, you can't change history. So why do you keep on focusing on history, right? You just look at it, but, you know, I think that we have a long ways to go to get over that. Maybe we need to build a critical mass of people that has worked together. And my husband, it's funny, my husband works for DPAA, right? And DPAA, so the Japanese are, you know, they wanted to develop the forensic capability for human identification. But DPAA has worked with Korea for a long time, and they had developed their forensic capability. So now the Japanese are the new people, so we're trying to make them work together. And Japanese MOFA, someone from their foreign affairs came in and said, we will not work with the, you know, Korean. You know, we will not work with the Korean because Korean are now a little bit ahead, so, you know, they'll be a little bit more superior, right? And they won't do that. And my husband has to put his foot down and say, no, you won't work. So we're trying to create, you know, these mechanisms or the environment where they can come together and work in like small wins, right? Trying to build these little small wins over time. Yeah, but it's not easy. It's like I said, you know, this process is so simple to look on the slide, but actually trying to, you know, implement it and try to get people behavior change is not that easy. Yeah, yeah.
But there are some intersections where working together makes sense, and I think we hear the Koreans know that having access to Japanese data is very valuable to them, but there's the history. And then the Japanese know that they had access to more Korean data, but early warning stuff. That was very valuable, but there's the history. And part of what we have gone through is trying to bring over here. We start looking for technology solutions to solve those problems. And because the technology generally has not been an issue for what we want to do the way we want to do it, but we now have to be looking for technology solutions that further help their cultural perspective of sharing, which is largely, I want to translate my portion so that I understand exactly what's shared and exactly what's not shared with whom, because it's about their information, not giving it to people that they don't have access to.
Right.
We look for a technology solution that gets to that capability.
Right. Well, so technology on the something small wins. You know, something small, something to get them started. Could be, you know, it may not be the only one, but like, you know, APCS is trying to build that cohort of fellows that, you know, Japanese military and Korean military working together so that they develop that trust at the individual level. But it's not easy. It will take a long time to build that, yeah. They have a lot in common, right? They wanted to focus on the differences over the commons that they have. So back to what we're saying, developing the common values. They do have them, but it's just that they just refuse to get to that, you know? And so suspending judgment, right? Let's stop suspending, let's suspend the judgment, especially related to history. But they can't seem to do that. So, yeah. All right.
We need to wrap up here.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Take a quick break, but I